Welcome to this tutorial on how to create frequency histograms using Excel 2010. Now, histograms are a type of data analysis tool used to examine the distribution of data in a population. In this lab, we're going to examine the frequency of different neck circumference measurements, heights, and foot lengths in populations of both men and women. Now, if we had the opportunity to meet in person, we would have measured our own neck circumferences, heights, and foot lengths using a tape measurement in lab. This would have resulted in a set of raw data that we could then use to examine in this lab. Now, because we are unable to do this, we're going to use a sample raw data set for men and women neck circumference for investigation 1. And then in investigation 2, we'll use randomly generated data sets to create histograms of different trait distributions. So let's begin by opening an Excel document where you have already entered the raw data provided in Lab 9. And you can find this data in Blackboard under Lab 9. So here's an Excel spreadsheet where I have input the raw data measurements for neck circumference for both men in this column, women in the next column. Now, if we had taken these measurements in lab, we would have used just a regular old tape measure, and that would have been in inches. We would have then had to convert those inches into centimeters because, again, this is science and we use the metric system. So now that we have this raw data, we can go ahead and use the outline in Appendix A for how to create frequency histograms in Excel. Now, if you have any questions about whether or not you have the data analysis tool pack installed on your computer, just go back and refer to that first tutorial that I posted in Lab 9 that shows you how to create a histogram and how to make sure that you have the data analysis tool pack installed. I do, so we're going to go ahead and select the data tab at the top of the page, and then over in the upper right hand corner you can see the data analysis tab. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. Now the histogram option is already selected, so we'll select OK. And now we're able to select the input range. Now the input range is the data that you want to examine. So in this case, we're just going to look at the input range for men. So I'm going to select the column and the data range for the men neck circumference. Now I have the labels option selected because I always like to make sure that I have my data sets labeled. If you don't want to do that, you can deselect it and just select the numeric values in the data. Alright, so we can also select the bin range. Now for the bin range, it really can be any values that you like. When you're examining data, you want to make sure that the bin range values that you select overlap your data. So if we're looking at data that runs from 2 to 8, you want to make sure that your bin range goes beyond those points. So you'll want your bin range to run from 1 to 10, so you get a broad kind of picture of what that data distribution looks like, even at the very ends where the data has dropped off. In this case, I've chosen a bin range that begins at 25 in increments of 5. So we'll go 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55. So here for the bin range, we'll select that range. And then we want to make sure that we have somewhere where this information can go in the spreadsheet. You don't want to export this to a new workbook, then it gets a little confusing trying to remember which bin and frequency goes to which data set. So just make sure that it stays within this worksheet. Just by selecting a cell, like I've selected N1, just somewhere within the worksheet that the data can be exported. You also want to make sure that you select the chart output, because then it will input the histogram chart directly in the worksheet. Okay, so now we have our histogram created. I'm just going to click and drag it over so we can look at it a little more easily. Over here on the right, you can see that the bin is listed on the left and the frequency of our raw data measurements are in a column on the right next to the bin. And as you remember from that first tutorial, we can just go ahead and delete the more and 0 points from this data. So now we're just left with the distribution or the frequency of these different measurements of neck circumference within a select population. Now if you remember, we were looking at a histogram of raw data for men. So if we look at this histogram, I'm just going to expand it a little bit so we can look at it a little closer. We can't really tell what we're looking at because we don't have anything labeled. So let's go ahead and label this data series by right-clicking on the frequency in the legend, select data, and this allows us to go in and we can actually edit the legend series. So let's select edit, and we know that this data came from men, so let's rename that series men. Select OK. OK again. So now we can see that the histogram values are displayed across the graph. We know that this series came from men because it's color-coded per series in the legend. The bin numbers are on the x-axis, the frequency is on the y-axis. Now we can also go in and adjust the format of this histogram by right-clicking Format Data Series, and let's go ahead and reduce the gap width to 0. And hit close. And then now we can see how the data is spread across the different measurements within this population. Now in order to look at the values for women, we would just recreate this histogram the same way that we just did, except when we input the value range for data, we would select the column for women here instead of the men. The bin range will stay the same, and it will create your data analysis chart on the right with the bin and frequency, and then you can go in and modify the series and the gap width in the histogram for the data series for women. If you have any questions, please feel free to rewatch this or send me an email with your question and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you for watching this tutorial on how to create frequency histograms in Excel for Lab 9.